Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of Flourish FM, a podcast for the good life. Our guest today is Dr. Laurie Santos. Laurie is a professor of psychology at Yale University and one of the world's leading experts on the science of happiness. She's also an expert on the evolutionary origins of human cognition and the ways our minds lie to us about what makes us happy. Laurie's course at Yale, Psychology and the Good Life, teaches students how the science of psychology can help us make wiser choices and live a happier and more fulfilling life. It's the most popular course ever taught at Yale, with almost 1 out of 4 students enrolled, and it's been featured in media outlets including the New York Times and the Today Show. The publicly available online version of the class, called The Science of Wellbeing, has attracted more than 4 million learners worldwide. Laurie's won numerous awards for her science and teaching and was recently named in Time Magazine as a leading campus celebrity. Nick, what did you enjoy most about our conversation with Dr. Laurie Santos?
A little bit of just fanboying, because Laurie is like a total rock star in this area, right? So it was really amazing to have her on, and very gracious of her to spend some time with us. She's got such a diverse, I think, wealth of knowledge in this area. Right, you mentioned, and it makes good sense, you're going to teach the most popular course ever in the history of a pretty long standing institution. Yeah. You've got to be bringing a lot of good stuff, right? And that's what she did in this episode. She, I think, understands a lot of what young people in particular are experiencing because she works with them so frequently, but she, in general, has such a great grasp of the research and the implications and what truly moves the needle in a practical way to complement what she understands academically in a very nuanced way, right? So I really enjoyed that balance that she brought to it, and just every part of it was really enjoyable.
Absolutely. Yeah, I love this conversation. We hope you do as well. This is How to Improve Your Wellbeing with the Science of Happiness with Dr. Laurie Santos. Dr. Laurie Santos, welcome. How are you doing?
Thanks so much for having me on the show.
Thank you for joining us today. It's a real honor to have you on our podcast. And you are, of course, an expert on the science of happiness. And everyone wants to be happy, and happiness is clearly vital for flourishing, the theme of our show. But it's extremely difficult to define happiness, and there's tons of definitions out there. So let's kick off our conversation today with the million-dollar question. What is happiness?
Yeah, we could have a very long podcast fighting about this definition, I think. I mean, I tend to think of happiness using the social scientist definition of happiness, one that I've stolen from Sonia Lubomirsky, a big figure in the science of happiness. But she defines happiness as being happy in your life and being happy with your life. And I quite like this definition. So being happy in your life is kind of how you feel emotionally, right? It's kind of the ratio of positive to negative emotions you have. So you want to have some joy and contentment, and you want to have a nice balance of that stuff with the sadness and the anger and the frustration and all the bad stuff, right? I think we'll probably get into this. I think happiness is not about having only positive emotions, but the point is ideally you have a decent ratio. That's kind of being happy in your life, or what researchers call the affective part of happiness. But there's also kind of being happy with your life, and that's what folks often call the cognitive aspect of happiness, right? How you think your life is going. So that's sort of the answer to the question, all things considered, how satisfied am I with my life? Do I have a sense of purpose and meaning, and so on? And so I like these two components because they're kind of like the in the trenches, your affective experience, are you feeling happy? And there's the kind of bigger part about how you think your life is going, which I think gets more to the name of this podcast of thinking about flourishing and so on. But I like to think of boosting happiness as trying to boost both of those parts. And that's important because I think sometimes when folks think about happiness, they think just about the affective part, just the first part. It's about joy and contentment in the moment and positive emotions. But I like to think of the real goal of happiness as being balancing both of those things together.
Okay.
I like that. Sorry, Jen, real quick shout out to Sonia. She's actually coming on 3 or 4 episodes from now, which we're excited
amazing.
about.
She's awesome.
So you're right. She's awesome. Yep. Amazing scientist in this space. I like the way you broke that down for 2 reasons. One, it seems to honor what seems mostly kind of incontrovertible, like pleasant affect tends to nourish us in a lot of different ways up to certain points. But it sounded like the cognitive side opens up the opportunity to maybe also explore types of happiness that aren't necessarily accompanied by pleasant affect, right? And the
That's
way
right.
we frame certain experiences. I wonder if you might, explore that a little bit more with us.
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the reasons I like this definition is that I think those two parts are dissociable, right? We could think of different, maybe people or different times in our life when they're dissociated. I think of, a new parent with a newborn. I have this close friend of mine who's super pregnant right now, and she's like gearing up for like, in a few weeks, I'm not going to sleep and there's going to be dirty diapers and I'm going to be all stressed out. Like, I think in her life, there's just a lot of stress and confusion and anxiety and whatever. But with her life, there's a sense that everything is fabulous, right? We're going to bring this new life into the world. I'm a mom now, right? And so that kind of is a time when the sort of affective part might be sort of crappy and stressful and not great, but the kind of overall sense of flourishing and purpose is huge. We could take the flip side, right? Which is like cases where you meet people, for example, who have every hedonic pleasure. I do a lot of talks for kind of people in private wealth management. So I see these really rich folks who, fly first class and drink the best wines and travel to the best vacations and have the best houses and cars and so on. And when they look at whether their life is flourishing, they feel incredibly empty. They think their life is going really badly. And so my goal and the goal of, I think, the scientific work on this topic is really to boost both, right? Like, what are practices that kind of boost the flourishing and boost the cognitive part of your happiness, but are also boosting in the trenches, kind of how are you feeling? I think if you can work both of those in a positive way, then you're ultimately living a really good life.
Mm-hmm. Awesome.
Like that.
It sounds like we can connect these two different types of happiness, if you like, with certain aspects of flourishing. That's what I want to ask you about here, because constructs of flourishing, there's various factors, including happiness, but also meaning, purpose, health, good relationships, life satisfaction, fulfillment of potential, flow states, achievement, and so on. Some of these you've mentioned are part of happiness with your life, some happiness in your life. How would you are there key components that make up each of these, and does some of them overlap?
Yeah. I mean, I think a lot of them wind up overlapping. I mean, you mentioned flow, right? So take that state, right? If you look at Csikszentmihalyi's work, he'll say that ultimately, like, a life where you are filled with lots of flow is probably a life where you feel really good in the trenches, right? It feels really good to be in flow a lot of the time. But, depending on if that flow is towards goals that you find meaningful and purposeful, you're becoming a musician or you're learning a sport or something, versus like you're on Reddit the whole time and you get lots of dopamine hits and you're sort of sucked in, but it's kind of this fake flow, right? If you're using that flow towards good things, I think then ultimately you're building up to a life that's filled with flourishing, or maybe a life that you think is going well too. And so I feel like a lot of the practices that lead to flourishing, a lot of the components of flourishing, probably wind up having both components in the sort of Sonia breakdown. Like, I think the things that lead to flourishing are the parts of your life that cause you to think your life is going well. But usually in the trenches, most of the time, although I think, as Nick pointed out, not all the time, but most of the time, they kind of wind up coming with positive emotions, at least down the line. Maybe not in the moment, but like
eventually,
once you've achieved the hard thing, good positive emotions.
It's an important distinction, I think. Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that.
Yeah, and okay, thank you, Laurie. And also, do you see there being a kind of rough division between which of these is more important, happiness with or happiness in? Or do you find this with people in terms of how they assess their life as a whole? Or do you find it's pretty much a 50-50 split? You have to have roughly the same sort of balance of happiness in and with, or is one more important than the other to achieve overall, or reach? Achieve is the wrong word. Reach.
This gets into the normative claims about happiness, right? Which, as a psychologist, I try to stay away from. I'm just trying to describe how it works, right? But I think for me, like, if I was picking a life, I'd want both to be high if I could, right? Like, I want to be living a life that I thought was going well, but if possible, in the trenches, it'd be great to have more positive emotion rather than less. And what we know is that there are strategies you can use to do that, right? They're the strategies that you can use in the face of a really tough time in your life that might be bringing purpose and meaning, but might suck in the trenches. There are things you can do to wind up feeling better kind of in your life in terms of your affect and stuff. So my hope is we don't have to pick one or the other. And for me, if I was picking, I'd want a life where you got both pretty well.
Mm-hmm. Are there kind of like correlations with personality profiles, or even kind of propensities to prefer or to focus on one or the other? Because we're just for context, we're coming off the heels a couple weeks ago of a chat with Shiga Oishi. I don't know if you know each other. Okay, yeah. Figured you do. And so there's just lots of similarities in terms of the way you're bucketing these things. And he broke it down for us as sort of like happiness, meaning, and richness, right?
Yeah. So he kind of has this other, I mean, you talked about him on the show, right? Like he has this other category that I didn't bring up, which is this idea of sort of psychological richness.
Yeah.
I put that as something kind of like John was saying about flow or meaning. Like I put it as something that if you achieve psychological richness, for many people, you wind up boosting kind of how you think your life is going because you feel like your life is
Mhm.
richer and it's kind of filled with stuff. And hopefully, a rich psychological life comes with, again, some positive emotion. Maybe not in the moment if you're really pushing yourself, but ultimately senses of satisfaction, contentment, positive reflection, these kinds of things. And those are affective states that we know will make you feel better.
Mm.
Mm-hmm.
Great.
Okay, let's dig into some misunderstandings about happiness because it seems to be probably I would argue one of the least understood yet most important concepts in our lives, both in terms of things
Totally.
something we want to understand, but also plays such a practical normative role in our lives, right? So, and my perception is it seems to be getting more misunderstood year on year. Like when I was younger, it didn't seem like there were just such widespread misunderstandings of happiness. And maybe that's because we've learned more about it and people talk about it more. Not sure, but what do you think are some of the most widespread misunderstandings about happiness?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are two. I think one is that the circumstances of our lives are what determines whether we think our lives are going well, we feel good in the trenches, right? So whether you're rich or whether you're doing well at work or whether you have the perfect relationship and so on. And I think it's worth noting that circumstances do matter for happiness, right? If your circumstances are like absolutely terrible, if you're a refugee or living below the poverty line or whatever, like definitely changing your circumstances are going to help. But probably for a lot of people listening to this podcast right now, the circumstances, like you don't need to move them around that much to feel a little bit happier, or that's not where you're going to move the needle that much. But I think that's a huge misunderstanding, right? If you think of the way we spend our time and the way we spend our money, if I look at, the college students I work with so closely and the dreams that they have for their future, they're like really doubling down on the circumstances, like what job they're going to get, how much money they're going to get, these kinds of things. And in fact, like again, you don't want to wind up like having really abject, terrible circumstances. But for the most part, that's not where we're going to move the needle. I think that's a huge one. I think another huge one is just this idea that like you can't change your happiness anyway. That somehow it's like built in. I don't know if people have like really clean theories about this, but like you're kind of a happy person or a not happy person, and you kind of can't change it very much. And I think what so much work in positive psychology shows is that actually you can, like by changing your behavior and your mindsets, you can really move your happiness around. You don't go from 0 to 100, but most of the interventions can kind of boost you up, around 10%. My colleague Dan Harris has this podcast, 10% Happier. And I think that that's
Yep.
an actively, that's a good way to frame the effect size of this stuff. Like you can go from a 7 to an 8 on a 10-point happiness scale, right? And that's good, right? That feels a lot better.
What do you think is, and with this can get into sort of that, your kind of background and expertise in the human cognition side as well. But what do you think kind of is the why behind some of these misunderstandings or miscalculations, if you will? And again, shout out to Sonia, right? In the myths of happiness and some of these like really pernicious things, right? These
Yeah.
issues that keep coming up. And I think you see them even more so with young people, especially in Western culture, right? Which
Yeah.
we all exist in. You have some hunches or maybe some data as to kind of what's behind that?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you think about our happiness levels from an evolutionary perspective, you realize just how much natural selection was absolutely not concerned with our happiness levels, right? Like natural selection is concerned with like us surviving and getting our genes into the next generation. It really doesn't care that we have these moments of positive emotion and contentment. It really doesn't care that we live a life that's satisfying. It just like wants us to get their genes into the next generation. And so it makes sense that our minds have these things built in that lead us astray when it comes to that stuff. Take, for
Mm.
example, the negativity bias, right? This idea that like really easy to notice all the terrible stuff in the news and in your life, a little bit harder and takes a little bit more intention to notice all the blessings, right? But that makes sense. We're not going to get anything good out of noticing the blessings, but if we notice, the tiger that's hiding out ready to attack us, or the fact that someone in our community is looking at us a little askance, and we might be in a bad social situation, right? Now, then we can take action. So I think natural selection is not building us to notice things accurately. It's sort of tuning our attention system to the stuff that matters for survival and reproductive success. And usually that's not the stuff that feels good. Like usually that's the stuff that feels terrible. I
Yeah.
also think that a good, natural selection is really built to have us go, go, go and get as much as possible, right? I think
Hmm.
it makes sense from the perspective of evolution to build in something like craving, what the Buddhists call like dukkha, right? Like the Buddhists call like tanha, right? Like we want stuff, we want to go after stuff. And you don't build in a stopping point for that kind of stuff either, right? Because it's like, according to natural selection, if you're I don't know, if you're a monkey foraging for nuts in a tree, how many nuts are there? I don't know. That's not built in. It's like, well, just keep going. Like if there's more nuts, you maybe try to get some more nuts. Like have some real pressure to go after it. Cause like,
Hmm.
if it's a good season, you might get more nuts. And I like to think that that's how kind of human craving works. Like I can get more stuff, more money, more accolades, right? There's always more available. And I should have mechanisms that cause me to seek that out just in case I'm in an environment that it's useful for. Does that make us feel good? No, it makes us feel really crappy. But there's the evolutionary logic to it. So I think when you think from the perspective of natural selection, you're like, oh my gosh, we just don't have minds that are built for flourishing. We have minds that are geared towards something else. But we're also very smart creatures who can make decisions about how we want to live our lives. And maximizing our genetic potential isn't necessarily the ones that so many of us are going for. We can make decisions to do things a little bit differently.
Yeah. Do you think another lie our minds tell us about what makes us happy is that happiness isn't buildable? Happiness isn't within our control. Happiness is something that genetically is
Yeah.
just kind of predetermined, if you like, or there's very little control we have over it. Because I can see how evolution would result in the negativity bias and other kind of lies our minds tell us. But do you think that's a lie our minds tell us, that you can't increase your
Yeah.
happiness?
For sure. I think for the two reasons we were saying, right, which is one that like we kind of assume it's our circumstances, and some circumstances are changeable, but a lot kind of aren't, right? It's hard to change your circumstances. You got to put in a lot of work, and I think some people feel trapped. But also this idea that you said, right, which is that like maybe our happiness is just kind of built into our genes. So it's like, yeah, you can't change it, right? The first thing I teach my students in this happiness class, and in fact, the first episode of my podcast, The Happiness Lab, was called You Can Change. And it just starts
Right.
there. Like, got to get over this misnomer. With some work, you can actually move things around. It does take work, right? It doesn't
Yeah.
happen naturally. You have to put in the time and effort, but you can actually feel better if you do that.
Yeah. So why would evolution give us that though? That's the that's the missing piece of the puzzle, trying to figure out here.
Yeah.
How has that got survival benefits for us, thinking that we can't increase our happiness?
I think it more falls out of the fact that evolution is building us to think that our circumstances matter, right? We have craving
Right.
for better and better stuff, right?
Yeah.
So we have that, and then we're like, well, wait, the stuff is hard to get. Like, I guess that's just going to be hard to kind of fix it.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Hmm.
It makes me wonder if there's kind of this both and where there's almost a healthy craving that builds additional robustness.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, that's got to be moderated by how one is spending money and acquiring resources and those sorts of things. But everything we're talking about makes sense. But it just occurred to me, like, is there a question, I guess, is there a healthier sweet spot?
Yeah. Well, this was Aristotle's insight, right? That we want the middle way for everything. You don't want to be,
Yeah.
too
That
cowardly or
resonates.
too foolhardy. You
Yeah.
want to have, nice bravery. And I think with craving, there's that, right? That ultimately we want lives that we think are going well. And it might be hard to have a life that you think is going well if you just like sit on the couch all day and don't do anything, right? We want to be helping others. We want to be getting into flow states. We want to be doing things that have purpose and meaning. And usually that doesn't happen from, non-inaction on a couch. But I think the problem is that then we confuse that with more, or not enough,
Yeah.
right? Into these perfectionist spirals. And that's what can
Yeah.
get us into trouble.
Or the wrong things, even maybe that come
Exactly,
from
right.
that
Yes.
labor, or
And
your
this,
colleague
we're
Paul Bloom,
having
or
this
chosen suffering, right? Yeah.
exactly. I mean, we're having this
Yeah.
conversation on the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, which, John, in our country is this document where they talk about, the pursuit of happiness. So for 250 years, we've been talking about the pursuit of happiness. But I think the problem is that we pursue stuff wrong, right? We think it's
Yeah.
about like
Right.
get that next accolade or get the promotion at work or win the lottery. And it's like, no, none of that stuff's going to matter.
Yeah. Well, speaking of pursuits, so we increasingly hear nowadays that directly pursuing happiness as a goal makes us paradoxically less likely to attain it.
Yes.
Why is this?
Yeah, I think the big issue is that we kind of get happiness wrong in the ways we've been talking about,
Mm.
right? I think it's not necessarily bad to go after happiness, but it's bad to go after something in the wrong way, and it's bad to go after the wrong thing. We've just been talking about ways that I think people go after happiness in the wrong way. Well, then I need to make more money, or then I need to get a new relationship, or I need to buy a new car, right? This is the way we think we're pursuing this stuff, but actually, that stuff's not going to work. I think we also assume that happiness is about us, right? It's about us as individuals, especially in like individualist Western societies. And so much of the studies and the research really shows that happiness is about becoming other oriented, doing for other people, connecting with other people, right? And so I think this idea of the pursuit of happiness, we think it's about me, but actually it's much more about the we, and we kind of go about it wrong. So part of it's like we're doing the pursuit the wrong way. But the second thing I think is that we get happiness wrong. I think most lay people, when you ask them what happiness means, are indexing on that affective part of happiness. They think it's about positive emotion all the time, right? And so when they go after things and they're not immediately in positive emotion 100% of the time, they think they're doing something wrong. And I think this is the kind of thing that we've been getting like incorrect even more recently, right? In the sense that, if you look at my young people, they have these like memes of like good vibes only, right? Like I have like a little bit of butterflies in my stomach right before a talk. I must be anxious, right? I think there's this idea that anything that feels a little bit different than perfect, good feelings all the time is somehow wrong. And of course,
Mhm.
that's not what we mean by pursuing happiness either. We mean a sense of pursuit of flourishing or pursuit of the idea that you think your life is going well. And that, as we've been discussing, is almost surely going to have some negative emotions in there.
Mhm.
Tying us back real quick, that's what I appreciated about Shige's kind of perspective on richness as well, is that it seemed to bring in another nice way to look at some of that unpleasant affect of some of those, perspective shifting, whatnot, which John and I talked about maybe is generally unpleasant for a lot of folks. Right?
Yeah, for sure. And I think, we don't often think about, even with meaning, I think we miss out on the psychological richness, right? Where,
Yeah.
a singular pursuit of one
Yeah.
thing, might not be the kind of life that you want when you look back on it, but kind of thinking a life where you have different avenues, different paths, different experiences, those things wind up being important. Yeah. So I love Shige's work on this.
That's what I appreciate, and John asked the question about the paradox, and what I think I heard you say is like these studies are sort of saying, yeah, when people try to hit this target, they miss often, but it's because they're not aiming the right way.
Yeah. And it's good. Yeah. It's they're aiming at the wrong thing, and their aim
Mhm.
is like going after stuff that's like
Yeah,
wrong. Yeah. Yeah.
exactly. And so like that brings me a little bit back to Shige and the earlier question about these almost like personality styles or
Mhm.
propensities. Like how does one know that they're aiming in a way that's right for them, if that's even a thing, right? That individual sort of like fit, if you will.
Yeah. I mean, my read is that like a lot of the basics when it comes to happiness is not personality specific. Like there might be some
Mm,
nuance there. And I know Shige's work has kind of covered some of this stuff, but I feel like some of the big hitters are like basically universal when we look at them, right? Taking time for social connection. Pretty much every
hmm.
available culture that's been studied finds that more social connection
Yeah.
is better. There's some personality, you might be more of an introvert, more of an extrovert. The ratio might be a little different, but overall, more social
Yeah.
connection is better. More doing for other people is just going to be better. Finding ways to be a little bit more present and getting moments in flow is just going to be better. And so I think, and this might just be my bias as a psychologist, that I tend to be much more on the like universalist things that are built inside from my work with
Sure.
animals than maybe, folks who study personality. But I think there's important nuance that we definitely want to understand. But overall, like a lot of the stuff that works just kind of works for everybody.
Mhm. Mhm. But it sounds like it's not just that the aim is sometimes misguided, so accruing more material possessions, let's say, but also the metric for knowing if you have become happier is misguided,
Correct.
right? It's how do I feel after this day of retail therapy, for example,
Yep.
right? Oh, I don't feel that great. Okay, I must have gone wrong there. Maybe they have gone wrong there. Or how do I feel after that day of looking after sick loved ones? I feel really bad. But that doesn't mean it's not increasing your happiness as a long-term pursuit. It's just
Mhm.
it might not feel good for quite some time,
Yeah.
right?
And sometimes if you get that not feel good feeling, it feels like you didn't do enough of the wrong thing. With the retail therapy, it's like, oh, I must not have bought the right things or enough of the things. In my podcast, The Happiness Lab, we had an episode with this guy Clay Cockrell, who's a psychologist for the extremely wealthy. He's like a mental health professional who works at the 0.0001%. Already that there's a job where there's mental health professionals for the 0.001% might strike some people as shocking, because it's like, oh my gosh, they won the lottery when it came to circumstances. But no, they're often miserable. And a thing that he talks about is that because they have this misguided theory that more money will make them happy, whenever they've accumulated lots of wealth and they're not happy, they don't think, well, hang on, maybe this whole focus on my circumstances was bad, I should have focused on something else. They think, aha, I just don't have enough money yet. I thought it was going to be $500 million, but now it needs to be $1 billion. I thought it was going to be this yacht, but it turns out I need a 7-bedroom yacht instead of a 4-bedroom yacht, right? Like the irony is, no one thinks like, well, maybe I was going after the wrong things. They think like, there's another rung on this ladder that I'm climbing up that I need to get there. They don't think that the ladder's, going up to the wrong spot, and they're getting it wrong.
Hi friends, Nick here with just a brief interlude to share with you an update on one of our newest partnerships with the Anti-Fragile Academy. Throughout John and I's conversations with many, if not most, of our guests, one thing has been made really clear. In order for people to flourish, thrive, experience the good life, they need to develop the capacity to not only navigate and endure, but ideally grow from the bad, grow from unpleasant experiences. That's why we're thrilled to be partnering with our newest sponsor, the Anti-Fragile Academy, an organization that I co-founded with Dr. Adam Wright, Director of Mental Performance for the Washington Nationals. At the Anti-Fragile Academy, we work with adolescent athletes, executives, and educators to help them understand some of the science, not just of optimal performance, but of well-being and anti-fragility. The ability not only to endure and bounce back from unpleasantness, but to actually come back stronger, to grow from it. Between Adam and I, we've worked with Fortune 100 companies, Inc. 300 executives, Division I programs, and elite professional athletes and Olympians from all over the world. To find out more about how you can leverage anti-fragility training, check out our website at theantifragileacademy.com.
We've talked a little bit about, younger age groups. John and I both have spent significant time in schools where you could sort of effectively say we probably taught the children of the people you're referring to here, right? And that sounds strikingly similar. And it sounds like what I often witnessed or felt like a race to nowhere.
Yes.
You see, or do you get a similar vibe? Not to generalize all the young people sitting in front of you, but is that something you have some active concern about?
Yeah, I mean, especially a really, high pressure place like Yale, right? I feel like,
Sure.
the students, they've been working really hard towards a particular goal, right? Which is, getting the kinds of circumstances that many people believe will be happy, right? They wanted to have the perfect grades so they could get the perfect job, so they could get a lot of money, most of them, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they're doing that often at the expense of the stuff that we know really does matter for happiness. For sure, their sleep and, their just general health and, inflammation and this kind of stuff, but also like their social connections, right? Their sense of presence. Often they're just like positive emotion in the moment. They're just like actively making themselves anxious and miserable. And Nick, I love that you brought up, the fact that it's families that are surrounding the kids that do this, because I often see that this wasn't something that, these kids individually came up with. Like, this is something that they've been nurtured towards for a long time. Right. This is not something they decided when they were a first-year student who arrived on Yale's campus. Like, this is something that they've been going for, often since I hear New York families talking about, like, I had to get my kid into the right daycare so they can go to the right, they can go to like an Ivy League ready preschool. And you're like, what are you talking about? So
it's the way, at least it looks to me psychologically, like you're setting a baseline for a young person that almost creates an unwinnable scenario, this insatiability or I have to match this level of income or this job, not just because of the toys or the lifestyle, but because I've come up in this community where other people have that expectation and I might actually lose my social circle
That's
if
right.
I'm not in whatever that might be, right? And I know that sounds, and in many ways it is, many levels of privilege, but the brain doesn't get that. If
That's
that's their normal and that's their baseline, that is still intense pressure and suffering along the
Yeah.
way.
Yeah, I mean, my colleague at Yale, Daniel Markovits, talks a lot about this kind of meritocracy trap, right? That
Mm,
we've created a system where it's like, well, if you work really hard, you could, get the spoils of this war, where you go to college, where you're going to get out and get one of these big salaries and so on. But that creates a race where everyone feels like they're feeling left behind. It just creates a race where there's no like stopping point. You can just get better and better and sacrifice more and more of your mental health. And the idea is like, that doesn't, you might be incredibly privileged to have won that meritocracy, but it feels really crappy like when you
yeah,
won, right? You're
yeah.
almost has sacrificed as much of your happiness and mental health and flourishing generally, right? As somebody who maybe didn't win the race.
Yeah. So, I mean, let's talk about your course and how this might be built into the course you
Yeah.
teach your students. So let's just tell our listeners and viewers a little bit about your course. So you teach a course at Yale, Psychology and the Good Life, which is the most popular course ever taught at Yale in over 300 years, with almost 1 out of 4 students now enrolled in the course today, which is wild, right? And the course teaches students how the science of psychology can provide important hints about how to make wiser choices and live a life that's happier and more fulfilling. Now, I want to ask you so many things about this course, but do you teach students in the course how to kind of reframe or kind of change beliefs that are really hard to change, or look at things differently, such as trying to escape from constantly comparing themselves to their peers in terms of material wealth and levels of income and so on, and trying to overcome biases that we evolved to have, such as negativity bias, and then pursuing the wrong things? Because these would be really hard things to teach. So if you do teach these, I'm curious how you teach these incredibly difficult things.
Yeah, we try. I don't know if we're effective in it. But yeah, I mean, the course really starts with misconceptions that we have about happiness, some of which we've already talked about, right? That you can't change it, that it's due to circumstances and so on. We also do kind of a deep dive into some of the biases that lead to those misconceptions, right? We've talked a little bit about things like negativity bias. Just the way our attention is wired makes it hard to pay attention to the good stuff and even just be present, right? Because we're so prone to get taken by whatever's in front of us. We also talk about other biases, like the fact that we get used to stuff. What's one of the reasons that those super wealthy 0.0001% individuals aren't happy and want more money? It's they got a lot of money, but then they quickly got used to it. This phenomenon of hedonic adaptation. And we talk a lot about what you just mentioned, John, this idea of like social comparison, and just this idea that setting reference points and comparing against those reference points is just a built-in feature of our mind, right? We do it in our perceptual systems. We do it for everything. But of course, it means you could be objectively doing quite well. But if you're just comparatively not doing as well as someone else, then you feel kind of crappy, right? And given that there are billions of people on the planet, statistically speaking, you're probably going to be doing crappier than someone out there on every single metric that we come up with. And so what does that mean? And so we kind of go through like, okay, this is how your mind is designed for this stuff. But what really can actually help, right? It's not circumstances, it's not the stuff we normally think. And that's when we do a deep dive into kind of, I think, the stuff that matters, which we categorize as kind of how you kind of behave in life, the mindsets and how you think about life, and also the emotions that you cultivate. It's a lot like what in clinical circles is often called the cognitive triad, that you want to think and act and feel differently. So we go through, well, how can you think differently? Well, you can develop more of a present mindset of gratitude, a mindset of self-compassion, right? How can you act differently? Well, you can get more social connection. You can prioritize sleep, maybe prioritize some free time and so on. How can you feel differently? Well, you can regulate your negative emotions or have some radical acceptance for them. And you can also find ways to make sure you're intentionally cultivating more positive emotions, even things like awe and so on. And so that's the idea behind the class. And then we end with, okay, that all sounds great, but it's hard, right? What do we know about how habits form and how we can set up better habits over time? And so we kind of do like a mini dive into sort of nudging and some of the behavioral economics work to ask, okay, how do you actually move your behavior? Which even for me, who's supposed to be an expert on this stuff, continues to be hard all the time.
I don't think people appreciate enough the behavior change. Like everything you've said and John mentioned earlier, we should feel empowered. We can do so much with this, but it is hard.
Yeah.
It's hard, and some things are harder than others, right? But I'm glad to hear you include the behavior change part, because I think that historically was maybe one of the limitations of say, somewhat siloed fields that would maybe focus on well-being or focus on resilience or whatever it might be, but didn't necessarily dip into some of the great work around the behavior change mechanisms that can enable those things, right? So it
Yeah.
sounds like you're taking a really holistic approach.
That's the goal. I mean, again, the stuff is really hard. It's one thing to know what you're supposed to do, but it's another thing to actually
Of
do it.
course.
We've been talking about eudaimonia for a very long time, right? Aristotle came out, he dropped, a lot of wisdom on us, but it's, a lot of people have even read Aristotle, but like we're not necessarily putting it into practice in our daily lives. And so again, and that includes me who's teaching the course, right? So whatever help we can get to actually do the behavior change, that's really essential.
So I'd love to hear your perspective on how long have you been teaching this course for?
So I started in 2018 when honestly
Right.
it seems a little prescient to be talking about college student mental health. That was like, we didn't know COVID was on the
Yeah.
way. We didn't know, a lot of changes to the political and economic landscape that were, starting back then, but kind of revving up and feel much worse now. Yeah, it was kind of interesting to see the evolution of how I've thought about these topics as it feels like so much of the college student mental health crisis has gotten worse.
Yeah. So
I was very. Oh, I'm sorry, John.
Well,
No,
I was
go
just going
ahead.
to say, so you've literally got like almost very similar periods before and post pandemic. So it must be a fascinating time to have covered. But sorry, Nick, going with the point.
No,
you're
I
gonna
want
make
to. So I want to ask about that because one of the things I think I heard in your answer too, Laurie, is so just to give a little context. Like one of a member of our advisory board for a business I run is Tal Ben Shahar. I've known Tal for a while. Tal and I met in the middle of my dissertation, which would have been around 2014, right? And the reason I bring up Tal, of course, is because I think was in a somewhat similar position teaching that inaugural pause psych course at Harvard, right?
Mhm.
And then to
And
John's
he read it to
point,
Tal. He did it 10 years before. My class went all viral and got all this news and stuff. But I'm like, Tal was doing this like over a decade before I
sure.
even.
Well, and shout out to you for shouting out him. But I think you're both doing really wonderful things in similar places, but it sounds like in still quite unique ways. And I'm curious how you've seen kind of things go from, say, maybe Tal's course to the way you started your course to the way you think about it now. Because to John's point, it's got to be quite the evolution given everything that's happened, not just in the research world, but just life in general over the past decade.
Yeah, well, I think, the biggest change has just been like how much college student mental health has tanked in that period. If you look at the period, I forget exactly which year started his course, but in the early 2000s to now, like pretty much every metric of college student mental health has gotten worse, whether that's rates of depression, rates of anxiety, rates of suicidality. You see this both when you look at like big surveys that look around the world from things like the World Happiness Report, the last 2024 World Happiness Report that just came out, the last 2025 World Happiness Report that just came out found that young people are like more sad than they've ever been, in the history of the report, over a decade of the report, right? And so that's not good. Things like rates of depression have doubled since like 2014, which 2014 doesn't feel that long ago. Like I still listen to songs from 2014 like they just came out yesterday, but like rates of depression have doubled. Like I just find it so incredible. And so, and all that was happening when my course started, right? Like I was quoting these horrible rates in 2018. And then like, we didn't know what was going to happen to people's social connection and their general sense of certainty, in the pandemic. And my sense is like, both the data back up and kind of my lived sense from anecdotal experience on campus is like, those things have just gotten worse.
How have you, if at all, found yourself maybe shifting maybe the syllabus? What I love about at least from what I've always understood about your course is you've got the syllabus, but you're trying to get them to do things, not just learn things and take tests, right? And so have you shifted at all maybe the ratio of what you're trying to nudge them to focus on? For instance, if you're worried about the social connection, you're doing more stuff around altruism and kindness and high quality relationships or whatever it might be, or has it stayed pretty consistent?
Yeah, it's mostly consistent. I think if I've changed anything, actually, it's been on the stuff where I've seen it really move the needle for students a lot, and that's been in the section on kind of changing your thought patterns. Yale students are incredibly perfectionist. They beat themselves up so much, right? They're so worried about the future, and so all these strategies that we can use to kind of just change your thought patterns around Those are ones I find when I teach them to students, they're just like mind blown. Like I didn't realize I could talk to myself in a different way. I didn't realize there were strategies when I'm on that ruminative loop to just cut it off, right? And often these strategies are like just incredibly straightforward. You just have to know what they are so you can use them. So that's a domain where I've been like, oh man, I think students have heard like, oh, exercise and sleep and social connection. I think they've heard that stuff a little bit. Doesn't mean they're putting it into practice, but none of that feels like, mind shattering news for them. The idea that you are not your thoughts and you can control your thoughts and like, hey, you should notice if your thoughts are beating the crap out of you. Those are things that I think my students are like, whoa, and it
100%.
really allows them to do some pretty serious skills building.
Yeah, I do a ton of work with collegiate athletes, same age group. Most of the programs are female athletes, but there's a mixture. We cover a lot of different topics, including some of the habit and behavior change stuff, which is why I love that you did it as well. But one of them we call thinking about your thinking, or this top-down sort of approach. So it's mindsets, it's cognitive behavioral techniques, acceptance commitment techniques, gratitude. These are all perspective taking, right? And it is by far, in a way, the most kind of engaging and I think rewarding content for young people to experience, because they're just not getting it elsewhere. And to your point, the techniques are often so simple for them to use and insert. They just need exposure.
Yeah, I agree. And so useful for my student athletes, of course. So many of them say that they use it, on the court or, on the track field and these kinds of things. I think this is the thing with all these techniques is like, they're just so useful for everyone,
Yes.
in their daily life,
Yeah.
right? Like there's no person walking around that can't benefit from recognizing that you are not your thoughts.
That's right.
What circumstances are.
Yeah.
That's right.
So let's dig a bit more into the kind of the changing research on age and happiness, because happiness researchers often talk about this U-shaped curve of happiness, right? Where we look at how happiness varies across our lives, with happiness being higher when we're younger and when we're growing old, but dipping in midlife. But recent research, you mentioned global happiness reports and also research from the Global Flourishing Study shows that this curve is starting to flatten because young adults globally are reporting being less happy than they used to be. Now, you've given some of the reasons why this might be. So COVID and post-COVID, we can think of other reasons too, like social media and so on. But why else do you think that young adults worldwide are less happy than they used to be?
Yeah. I think you mentioned some of them. I wish it was one thing. I wish there was like a smoking gun because then we could just fix that. But no, I think it's so many things. I think it's expectations. I think it's the subtle ways that their social connection is going down over time. We point the finger at technology, but really they're just living in a whole culture where just like really tiny social interactions happen less often, not necessarily because of social media, because they're on Instagram, but just the way culture works or the way they use technology. I had this funny interaction with my students when I was at head of college on campus, which is like when some of my students came up to me and they're like, Hawk Santos, which is my title, head of college Santos. Hawk Santos is this weird number on the wall in my room. Like, what's this number? I'm like, what is she talking about? So I go in her room and I'm like, oh, that's a phone jack. There used to be phones in your college dorm rooms, right? And the student was like, oh, so cool. And she was like, well, what would happen if I was like, if I picked up the phone and it was like, for my roommate, like, did we each get a number? And I'm like, no, there's just one number for like, the whole 4 of you or however many students were in the room. And they're like, well, what would happen if I picked it up and it wasn't for me? And I was like, oh, well, you'd have to, have a little, like, well, John's not here, but like, Nick's coming back soon. And I was like, oh my gosh, they don't do that. When they go to their friend's house, they show up outside and text, I'm outside. Like they don't talk to their, taxi driver, or like when they're ordering food. It's like these teeny tiny social interactions that we get good at, they just like don't have.
Oh, yeah.
That same interaction, the student asked the other question that, kids today ask, which is like, well, if the phone's in my room, like, how would I use it? Like when I was at the library or in the track field or whatever, like, how would I stay in touch? And I was like, well, you wouldn't. Like, you'd just be able to get away. And I'm
That's
like,
right.
oh my gosh, they're never able to do that now, right? They're never able to just be present and walk around. The information kind of always with them. And so I think we haven't calculated just what these changes, in addition to the stuff we were talking about before about, preparing these kids from preschool to go on and get these accolades that we know aren't going to lead them to the flourishing life they think. I think, all those things are true, but just on the curves, I find that research really depressing, right? Like, because we don't know what happens to the curve when you already start flat, right? Like, like our generation is in our nadir in like our late 40s. I just hit 50, so I'm actually on the upswing. Like I'm coming back up the curve. So I'm very excited
Congratulations.
about that. Thank you. But we don't know what's going to happen to these current 19-year-olds when they're my age, right? Like it could be that it, has the same bottom as everybody else, but it could be that it gets worse. Like it could be that, when we hit midlife for this generation, we experience like, horrid increases in suicidality, like just incredible mental health dysfunction. Like we just don't know. But I find that really worrying that, yeah, if it's this bad now when they're supposed to be happy, what is it going to look like when they're in the sandwich generation and they're dealing with kids and elderly parents and, the bleakness of midlife and so many other things. So, yeah, so I think we don't exactly know what's causing it, but it's so worrying. And I think it's something that we need to pay attention to fixing so it doesn't get worse over time.
What's so interesting about the way you finish that with all those examples, which are perfect, is those are all experiences with a lot of unpleasantness. And the whole time you're talking, and then part of it is the book sitting on the chair next to me, Michael Easter, The Comfort Crisis. And like, does that resonate a little bit? Like, is there a little bit of, hey, I don't want to point the finger or victimize, one way or another, but you said like multiple variables. Is there something to be said for losing practice doing some of these hard things? Is even, you said it could be as innocuous as like having to call a landline, but you know what my head went to immediately was like calling a crush in high school and having to go through father first.
Yep.
And that was unpleasant. It was really unpleasant, right? But like, how many of those things are they potentially missing? So
totally. And I think just in general, right, they kind of shy away from hard things, right? This is something that, we see in part in this sort of meritocracy trap, right? To be good at something, you have to be perfect, right? So if you're not good at it, you kind of shy away from it. You pick the one thing you're good at. You pick the easy classes. You pick the easy test, right?
Very fixed.
I think and I think, because we have such anxious students, well-intentioned parents who want to help their students try to make everything as easy as possible. Sociologists claim that we've moved out of the helicopter parent generation, which is what we were in before, where parents would kind of swoop in whenever there was a crisis. And now the idea is that we're in what's called the lawnmower parent generation, where you're kind of mowing the lawn and getting everything perfect so it's flat and pristine for kids to walk on before any crises happen. So it's not just that parents kind of swoop in and fix the crisis, which of course is the time for the discomfort where you get the really essential practice. Right? Those are really good moments of learning, but they're kind of now clearing out all the crises so the kids never really face them. And so I think it's not kind of blaming and shaming the kids.
No.
But it's really thinking critically about, what parenting practices we're using to kind of help kids. And, props to parents, like it's hard to see your kid go through discomfort, I don't know if your dad was watching you when you're on the phone calling the other dad and kind of cringing, like that's not great for any parent to see. But if we take away those opportunities for discomfort, then we remove from our kids a really important opportunity to learn and to get their chops kind of navigating negative emotions.
Got to be part of why it's so hard is not only is maybe the young person experiencing unpleasant emotion, but then the parent or the coach or the leader, whoever, the mentor has to experience unpleasant emotion watching. Right. Or knowing that person is experiencing it. So you're getting this double dose of something that's already, I think, we're inclined to avoid when possible.
Yeah. My colleague, Julia Leonard, here at Yale, does this lovely work on when parents take over. She's really interested in this context of like problem solving or like math homework or something. When do parents kind of just say, oh, let me do that for you? And she finds that it's partly related to the kids' level of anxiety, but it's like a lot more related to the parents' level of anxiety. The parents are feeling anxious. Their kid doesn't get it. It's like, oh my gosh, I can't handle that anxiety. And so it speaks to the fact that we all got to get better at accepting and regulating our negative emotions, especially parents, because if you don't, you might be inclined, even more inclined to kind of take away these good learning opportunities.
Well, thank you, Laurie. This has been an incredible conversation with a million things to take away. We'd love to, for our final question, dig into an important practical step our listeners or viewers could take away from this. Now, there's a million practical steps, I'm sure, that and you teach your students. If you could recommend one or or 2 or 3, however many you can describe in a short time. Really important things that someone listening to this could start doing today that would have the potential to significantly increase happiness with and in their life long term. What would that step be?
Yeah, I think first just remembering what we started with, right, which is that you can change. You have agency over this, right? So there are things you can do to feel better. And I think, my top 3 list of things you can do to feel better, first is always social connection, just like every available study shows that that's like, going to make you feel better, even if you feel it's not. I think the other is to sort of really watch your thoughts, notice when you're beating yourself up, see if you can change your thought patterns around. And I'll end with a third one that we haven't really talked about, which is the importance of what scholars these days are calling time affluence, the sense that you feel a little wealthy in time. Turns out monetary affluence doesn't help us a lot, but time affluence matters a lot. And so giving yourself the gift of rest, giving yourself the gift of a break, which makes it easier to find activities that give you flow. It makes it easier to get social connection. Finding ways to get in a little bit of rest and free time are also very important for your well-being.
Yeah, it's great. That oscillation. Yeah. Laura, we're going to link out to everything, the Happiness Lab, your course, all that sort of stuff. But where would you like to send people? Where can people find out more? Where do you like them to go and learn a little bit more, connect with you, or whatever it may be?
Yeah, so you can check out drlauriesantos.com, drlauriesantos.com. That has links to all the podcast episodes and the courses and so on, especially good stuff for parents and teachers who might be wanting to learn more too.
Excellent.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Dr. Laurie Santos, for a fascinating conversation. We've learned a ton. We hope those of you listening or watching have as well. This has been How to Improve Your Well-Being with the Science of Happiness with Dr. Laurie Santos.
Thanks so much for listening to Flourish FM. We hope you enjoyed the content. Please be sure to leave us a 5-star review and hit that subscribe button wherever you listen to your podcast and on all major social media platforms.
And if you visit our website, flourishfmpodcast.com, you can sign up to our newsletter. We send out a weekly newsletter. First newsletter of every month, we share a long-form blog. And every newsletter, every week, we share highlights from our previous episodes. Please hit subscribe on our website.